So, good afternoon. Let's start this parallel session, Innovation and Leadership to Reduce the Impact of Hazardous Substances and Litter, including Pharmaceuticals and Microplastics. Must be an academic title, that one. It's a long one, isn't it?
I'm not responsible.
You're not responsible. Oh, good. That's good. Anyway, this session, we will have 5 speakers, so we have a quite tight schedule again. But I really do ask you to consider if you have questions. I really would like to see questions coming from the floor, and me just playing the role as the moderator and timekeeper. So I hope that you will have questions and curious questions. Without really wasting a lot of time, I would like to introduce Magnus Breitholtz, who is the professor and head of ecotoxicology unit at the Stockholm University. Magnus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay. Is there one last person who wants in? No. Okay. In the coming 10 minutes, I will quickly take you down to the dark, deep places of the Baltic Sea. Down there, I will problematize around the use of chemicals. And in the end, I will take you up to the surface again, where there's light and hope and possibilities for the future. The Baltic Sea is often considered one of the most polluted seas in the world. Whether this is true or not is perhaps difficult to say, but we know that the ecosystem is inherently sensitive, and there is a large population living in the catchment area, about 90 million people. We have, for certain, also witnessed problems with eutrophication, with overfishing, with chemical contamination or pollution, if you will. However, the past decades, the exposure routes of chemicals to the Baltic Sea have changed. We have managed many of the problems with emissions from the traffic sector, from the industry, which has certainly improved the situation. At the same time, since the 1930s, the global production of chemicals have increased 400 times. Driven by consumption, the increasing numbers and amounts of chemicals in society have shifted the focus away from a few point sources to many diffuse sources. And as a result of import of consumer products and long-range transport, chemicals that have been banned here since long might still be emitted here, and also new chemicals that we are not even aware of that are produced elsewhere in the world. And to tackle this increased dependency of chemicals, society obviously needs to take action to secure that the environment is free of hazardous chemicals. We have heard about the new development goals and so on. This is a difficult task. And luckily, Europe, the European Union, has probably the most advanced chemical legislation in the world, with different regulatory frameworks for different types of chemicals and different types of uses. The problem is that, regardless of this, it doesn't mean that we control or have control over all the chemical hazards and risks that we are concerned about. And I'll come back to why in a short while. I'd first like to say what the ambition is with these regulatory frameworks. What we'd like to avoid is chemicals that have these properties, the P, B, and T. Persistent and bioaccumulative substances we don't want, since history has educated us that these chemicals might create problems long after their exposure started. Via bioaccumulation, they might eventually reach toxic levels. When it comes to toxicity, this is specifically problematic to identify because there are so many ways a chemical can be toxic. So it's more or less impossible for us, even for me as a researcher, to say exactly, at least in a short period of time, what type of toxicity a specific chemical has. So what are we sort of concerned about still, even though it's difficult? Well, of course, reproductive failure, endocrine disruption, the toxicity of mixtures, whether chemicals might influence the prevalence of disorders, diseases. The list can be made much, much longer than this, obviously. Many of these unwanted effects, unfortunately, it's difficult to identify with the current legislation that we have. That is the fact of today. It is extremely difficult. The test and test systems that we have do not sufficiently well characterize these types of effects, although it's our primary concern. Substances are still risked one by one. We don't assess groups of chemicals. As we substitute chemicals, we don't necessarily substitute chemicals to replacement chemicals that are better, or often we don't know whether they are better or not. A good example of this is that we have banned a few perfluorinated substances in the last few years. Still, there are thousands of other perfluorinated chemicals out there that we know very little about. They might be less harmful, but in many cases we don't know. Last week, the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, reported that over 90% of industry registrations of high-volume chemicals do not meet the requirements of the legislation, primarily due to lack of toxicological information. So just because the legislation is there, it doesn't mean that it works and that we're safeguarded against exposure to hazardous chemicals. This is a little bit tricky because it's a very big picture. Oh, there it comes. Okay, so what you might think? People get older and there's still fish in the sea. We heard about that today. And if there's less fish, it's probably due to overfishing, right? Well, often, I have to admit, as a researcher, we don't really know the relative contribution of different types of anthropogenic pressures, unfortunately. But I do know, I'm almost certain that if we continue with this consumption society that we live in, we will for sure continuously emit poorly characterized substances. Okay, now we're deep down on the dark, hopeless bottom of the sea. You feel, well, the lights are still on, but it's really distressful. But remember what I said in the beginning, things also improve. We didn't have a chemical legislation 30 years ago. The traffic sector and also the industry, the emissions have improved, or there's less emissions. And also in the short-term perspective, we can do things, we can see things that improve quite fast if we work together. And I will provide you with a few examples on that. The first one is on chemicals, and ironically, or pharmaceuticals. A major route for chemicals into the environment is wastewater treatment plants. And until now, these plants have primarily or mainly been developed to control emissions of nutrients. And pharmaceuticals is one group of chemicals that are primarily released via wastewater treatment plants. But pharmaceuticals, in contrast to many other chemicals, can cure people that are ill. So we have to manage these chemicals differently. We can't ban pharmaceuticals. Still, one way to reduce emissions, although I think that we should work on upstream solutions as far as possible, one way to reduce emissions of these types of substances is more advanced wastewater treatment technologies. Such techniques are costly, but are already available and have been implemented here in Sweden and also elsewhere. And I think we will hear more about that later on by Anna Lövsén. I think I worked with pharmaceuticals for the last decade, and I think this implementation has been pretty fast, considering that the new knowledge that has been generated the last decade, I mean, it could have taken another 20 years. That was my sort of feeling when I started working on that. But it has happened fast, and I think it's positive. And I think it is much due to that different stakeholders in society have worked on this together. My second example concerns microplastics. And although microplastics are primarily formed in the environment as a result of weathering and degradation of larger plastic pieces, they can also enter the environment via wastewater treatment plants. For instance, by using cosmetic products, as we heard of earlier today by the Ministry of Environment. And what is worrisome is that microplastics and plastics in general degrade very slowly, which means that we will have to confront old sins, current sins, for many years to come. And in addition, there's an increasing number of reports showing that microplastics can be taken up and affect aquatic organisms negatively. Researchers, some of them here, Marie, at the Baltic Sea Center, 1.5 years, 2 years ago, came up with a very strong recommendation to ban such unnecessary use of microplastics in cosmetic products. So it's therefore positive that Sweden is now planning to ban microplastics in cosmetic products that are washed off. There is a referral from the government that is currently circulated among Swedish stakeholders. And I think that this recommendation is really strong. And the process to come up with this recommendation has been very fast, and much due to the strict and constructive dialogue between many stakeholders in society. And I think we will hear more about microplastics, perhaps plastics I know, and how to avoid plastic pollution in the coming minutes. My last slide, or my second last slide, concerns circular economy. In December 2015, the European Commission outlined a strategy supporting a transition to a more circular economy within the EU. In a circular economy, the value of products, materials, and resources is maintained in the economy for as long as possible, and waste generation is minimized. And cornerstone to reach this ambition is to avoid introducing hazardous substances or hazardous chemicals in goods so that the materials can be reused. Apart from protecting the environment and humans, we can thereby save energy and avoid using limiting natural resources. Perhaps turning Europe into a circular economy is the key to start managing hazardous chemicals sufficiently well. I believe so. It will require improved legislation, but I also think it will need non-legislative incentives, much that might be something that the municipalities can work on. Consumption is a key aspect in the circular economy. It involves all citizens in the EU, and in fact, it involves all the private actors and the public actors. Public procurement stands for almost 20% of the goods that are consumed within the EU. Hence, a strict procurement approach may have a significant positive impact on the management of chemicals in the or a circular economy. This, I know, is something that you might perhaps touch on later on. So let's see. It's clear that managing chemicals in society is far from trivial. Stronger and better chemicals legislation is probably needed. I think definitely it's needed to minimize the negative impact of hazardous chemicals in society. But I also think that turning EU to a circular economy will involve non-legislative actions. We have already seen that when different actors in society work together, rapid and effective measures can be taken. Hopefully this conference and others to follow can help us set common goals for how to protect the Baltic Sea and the people living in this catchment area. I think we will hear a very good example in the end about a positive and effective collaboration between different stakeholders as well. So I'm happy to see so many people. I've been part of the steering committee for developing this conference, and up until now at least, it has been very positive, and I hope it will stay that way. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks also for giving that little taste of what we will actually hear in this session, and that's wonderful. Any questions? I'd like to take one or two questions. Yes, please. Do we have a microphone even? I don't know. No, we don't. Speak loud.
Well, if we're truly concerned about endocrine disrupting effects, that would be on my top list. When I say that the tools are not really available, I mean the standardized test procedures that are primarily used to risk assess chemicals. Then there is an ocean of methods that are out there in the research community. But since they're not standardized, they're not often used. More today than before, but still I see that as a problem. A very good example of that is bisphenol A and the discussions the last 15 years where 200-300 scientific reports show that bisphenol A is an endocrine disruptor, and you have two, perhaps, standard risk assessments which are governmental risk assessment that shows that they're not. They can't really identify that type of effect using those tests and test strategies that they have used. So that's problematic. I would like scientific data to be used also in the risk assessment framework. I think that could be a really good way forward.
Mm-hmm. Any other quick question? Yes, please. We have one up front. You have to speak up, unfortunately.
Thank you for a great presentation. I would like you to take me back to the slide you talked about microplastics. Even though we're all representing different agencies or consumers, could you please give us a good idea of what to avoid when we go shopping and what are we supposed to look for on the labels in order to prevent that?
As I said, hopefully in a very short time, I hope we don't have to concern about that. I don't know how fast that kind of regulation can be put in place, but soon, I'm very positive, we will have a ban on microplastics that can be washed off. I think you should talk to Marie, who sits in the back.
So in the
meantime? That's not really my expertise, what kind of products you should and shouldn't buy. But I think there is some kind of labeling that you can see whether it contains microplastics or not. Please ask Marie about I think she knows better than me.
Marie, where is Marie? There. Oh, that's really behind, yes. So is there a label?
Yeah.
Okay. So poly something. Then you avoid it, but the chocolate is still okay, the poly. So yes, you wanted to add?
Oh, that's great.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Yes, a final one. Quick. Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for also answering the questions. We love that when we are standing up here. They take the Q&A among themselves. But you get a boat trip. Not too bad, huh?
It's great. I don't have to answer the questions.